topic. DNA duplication we finished. What was it? Find out. We finished with DNA duplication, essential methods.
What happens at sign? Reduction of impulse needed. All the portions.
Production of synapse. That means now next stage we have to start with the parts of the brain. Switch on. Okay, now we are already done with see there nervous coordination. For the concept of nervous coordination, we have been doing the structure of the neuron, parts of the neuron, functions of the neuron, transmission of impulses in the neuron, right? Is that part clear? How does nerve impulse transmission take place? Go through that. Nerve impulse transmission. What did we understand? What is the nature of nerve impulse transmission? What are you supposed to remember? Nerve impulse transmission. What is the process? Nerve impulse transmission. The nature of nerve impulse transmission. What are you supposed to write? Electrochemical. Do you remember? That is what we studied. Nerve impulse transmission is electrochemical. Why is nerve impulse transmission known to be electrochemical? Because check the diagram that I had already explained the other day. Check those figures that we had studied. The concept of nerve impulse transmission. Why would we say that it is electrochemical? Because all throughout the axon, the nature of impulse transmission is electrical, and from the axon terminal to the next dendrite, which is in the form of chemical nature of impulse transmission. What are neurotransmitters?
Chemical substances
That are released
that are released at the axonal end of the
axon terminal. Chemical substances released at the axon terminals. Do you remember all these? Chemical substances, droplets of chemicals that are released at the axon terminals, which help to stimulate the next neuron. You remember those diagrams that we had studied the other day? Two neurons, how they can get communicated with each other from one neuron to another. How will the message pass? With the help of chemical substances. Give one example of neurotransmitters. What was it? One example of neurotransmitters.
Acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. ACETYL. We have to remember that. ACETYL. Acetylcholine is one such neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine is one neurotransmitter that always helps in the transmission of nerve impulses. Now, after the concept of nerve impulse transmission, structure function of the neuron, next we have to understand the concept of the spinal cord. Now, look at one diagram. The concept of the spinal cord. Look at one diagram in your book. Look into one diagram in your book. Now, check the diagram of the spinal cord with the reflex action. Check. There. That page. That way. What is it? Page. Which page is it? Tell me. 103. 103. If you have the textbook, refer to page 103. Now for page 103, when we are talking about the spinal cord. Now little bit on the spinal cord, we have to learn to understand the concept of the reflex. To understand the central nervous system, we talk about the central nervous system. What is the central nervous system made up of? The central nervous system is made up of two parts. Which are the two parts of the central nervous system? The brain and the spinal cord. Now, where is the spinal cord? From where does the spinal cord start? What is the spinal cord? So, when we are talking about what is spinal cord, what are you supposed to understand? Spinal cord is always a bundle of axons. What is the spinal cord? Spinal cord is always a bundle of axon, and this bundle of axon is always protected by what? Protected by a bony casing. What is that bony casing known as? The vertebral column. So I'm talking about what is the spinal cord. How can we define the spinal cord? Spinal cord is always a bundle of the axons. And this bundle of the axon is always protected by the vertebral column. It is protected by the vertebral column. So now that I talk about the bony cover of the brain, what is the bony cover of the brain? The bony cover of the brain would be the skull. Bony cover of the spinal cord would be the vertebral column. Now look at the diagram that you have in your book. Very, very important. The diagram, you should know it very nicely. The diagram, you should know it very nicely. Now this particular diagram, that is the section of a spinal cord shown there. Tick that diagram, very important. Now, to talk about this particular concept, what is the basic function? First of all, we'll try understanding what is the job of the spinal cord. What would be the function of the spinal cord? What is the spinal cord doing? Number one, the spinal cord is regulating variety of voluntary and involuntary functions in coordination with the brain. So what is the job? What is the function of the spinal cord? If you have to understand, what type of functions does the spinal cord carry out? What type of functions does the spinal cord carry out? Now, when we are talking about the functions of the spinal cord, what are the functions of the spinal cord you are supposed to understand? We already assume it. What is talking about you? 8, 1, 2, 3, 0, I'm going to complete with reflex action now. Brain, everything today. You listen, you understand. You don't listen, it's your loss. Jao, jao, jao. Fatafat. 1, 2, 3. Hataओ और उधर जाओ. Now, when we are talking about the functions of the spinal cord, what are we going to write? The functions of the spinal move. What is the function of the spinal cord? The function of the spinal cord regulates or controls the variety of voluntary and involuntary functions. A large number of voluntary and involuntary functions in coordination with the brain. In coordination with the brain. In coordination with the brain. Now, say suppose when we are talking about the voluntary and involuntary functions. मैंने क्या बोला? उधर जाओ ना दोनों. If you move that side. Now, when we are talking about the voluntary and the involuntary conditions, what is meant by a voluntary function? Now, I understand that what is this spinal cord doing in our body? The spinal cord can control variety of voluntary functions, but in coordination with the brain. I may understand the entire process of muscle contraction in coordination with the brain. I may understand the process of sneezing and the process of contraction of the muscular wall of the stomach and the intestine and the food pipe and the blood vessel in contraction with the brain. So now that is what we understand, that what is the spinal cord doing, carrying out a whole lot of voluntary and involuntary functions with coordination, in coordination with the brain always. Whenever we are talking about, again remember what I am speaking here, whenever we talk about any regular programmed functions of the body, like movement of the lungs, movement of the stomach wall, intestine, blood vessel, these are regular functions of the body. Yeah, the brain is very much involved along with the spinal cord. But now I talk about one more function that the spinal cord controls, and that is what is It controls the reflexes. It controls the reflexes. Now, what is the meaning of reflex? What is meant by reflex? Reflex is any type of a sudden involuntary function, sudden involuntary action that we show in response to a stimulus always. But at that time, now that we are talking about the reflexes, is reflexes, did I write it controls reflexes in coordination with the brain? No, whenever it is controlling reflexes, it is just taking decisions on its own. The spinal cord controls reflexes. So now, when we are talking about the concept of reflexes, then what is meant by reflex? What is the basic definition of reflex action? When we are talking about the basic definition of reflex action, what it is? Reflex action can always be defined as a spontaneous, rapid, automatic. It is absolutely done as per the stimulus, automatic, involuntary, automatic and quick, involuntary response, involuntary response involuntary response due to a stimulus, So now that we are talking about that, this particular concept of reflex, we try understanding what is reflex. Here I am saying that reflex is always any type of a involuntary activity which happens spontaneous, very rapid, where there is no pre-planned anything. There is generally no learning or experience anything. Say suppose whenever there is an irritant and you are sneezing, that is a reflex. Whenever somebody is pinching you and you hit him back or move your hand, that is a reflex. You touch something very hot and you move your hand, that's a reflex. You step on something weird, you withdraw your feet, that is a reflex. So what is the meaning of reflex? Any type of an activity. Now that you are writing, is it a reflex? No, because it is pre-planned. It is programmed. And in this activity, the brain is very much involved. So definitely it cannot be a reflex. Then what is a reflex? Any type of a response where our brain is not involved. Now, in this concept, when we are talking about the activity of the brain there, and now we understand that the activity of the brain, that then what are some of the parts involved here for a reflex? Look at the diagram, pick the diagram. So reflex would involve certain pathway and the components. Let us first of all talk about the components involved in reflex action. What are the components involved in reflex action? Number one is a sensory neuron. Number one is a sensory neuron. Number two is I start with a receptor. Components of a reflex action. A receptor should be there. Then a sensory neuron should be there. Then we are talking about now the third component, that is the spinal cord itself. And then we are talking about the motor neuron. And this motor neuron will be followed by a target gland. So now when we are talking about all these five components, what are these components doing? What are their respective functions? Follow the diagram. I talk about the receptor. Which part of the body? The eye, the ear, the skin. Now these are, now that I talk about the receptor, then what is the job of this receptor? What is this receptor doing? The receptor's function is only to receive the stimulus. The job of the receptor, the eye, the ear, the skin, the nose, all considered as receptors. Then what is the job of the receptor? What is it doing? It is constantly receiving the stimulus. The receptor will always be receiving the stimulus. How did I define the word stimulus? The other day when we were talking about nerve impulse conduction. What is a stimulus? Stimulus is any agent or a factor that would bring about some response from a part of the body. Any type of a factor or an agent. Now, when I talk about that, you are walking on the street and you hear the horn of the car and you move towards the left. You hear the horn of the car and move towards the left. Or say suppose you get to see a car coming towards you, flashing light, and you move towards the right. Which is the stimulus there? The light or the sound is the stimulus, because whenever you see the light, you are showing some response. Part of your body showing some response. So the part of the body showing some response due to a cause, that cause will be always known as the stimulus. So what is that concept of stimulus? Any agent which helps to show a response. Any agent due to which part of the body would show a response. So always remember the definition of the stimulus I gave you the other day also. Now what is the job of the sensory neuron? This is what you're always asked. What is the job, hands up, what is the job of the sensory neuron? You listen first and then you will ask. When we are talking about the job, now look into the particular diagram. All of you will have the diagram in the share the book. Or in the volume also the same diagram is there. All of you take out that diagram, refer to the diagram. All of you will refer to the diagram and refer and understand what I'm speaking. So now, when we are talking about, are you able to see the sensory neuron in the diagram? Are you able to see a sensory neuron in the diagram? The neuron which moves from the receptor towards the spinal cord. The neuron which is moving from the receptor towards the spinal cord. That particular neuron is known as the sensory neuron. So what is the function that you should write? Carries information from the receptor towards the spinal cord or towards the central nervous system. Now, actually, when I talk about the sensory neuron is actually inside the spinal cord. The sensory neuron is actually inside the spinal cord. Then, when we look into this H-shaped structure, now here, you can actually come across. Now just underline some of the parts. Let me just tell you some of the parts. You just underline some of those parts. They underline in the diagram so that you know every part very carefully. Underline the sensory neuron, underline the spinal cord. Is it marked there? The spinal cord, is it marked? The spinal cord. Then next is when we are talking about the spinal cord is there. Then after that, you underline the motor neuron. Mark the motor neuron in the diagram. Mark the motor neuron in the diagram. Mark the receptor in the diagram. Is the receptor there? If these parts are there, you mark. Otherwise, you will have to mark all these parts. Now that I draw this diagram, the parts which are not marked in your diagram, please write them down. There will be a receptor always. There will have to be a receptor always. Then from the receptor, the messages are being carried to the spinal cord, to the central region of the spinal cord. Now, it is a sensory neuron and it is carrying the messages. So the the cell part is here, and then we talk about a particular neuron and the axon part will be here. Between this, now here again there is one neuron there. There is actually one more neuron here that we understand with its axon. And it is a comparatively, it is a short small neuron followed by another neuron coming here, which will again deliver the messages, and these messages may again come out and reach another specific region. It will reach another specific region, and that particular region, what are we going to term them as? This is known as the effector organ or the effector gland. Now, what are these neurons known as? These neurons in the chain that we come across, this particular neuron would be termed as the motor neuron. What about this small neuron that we understand? This small neuron is known as the association or the relay neuron. This is known as the association or the relay neuron. We'll learn what is the function of these type of neurons also. And then the first neuron that we had already named was the sensory neuron. What is the job of this? This is known as the sensory neuron. You are very, very often asked about the difference between the sensory and the motor. What are you supposed to write? What is the job of a sensory neuron always? The job of a sensory neuron, carry information from the receptor towards the spinal cord or CNS. Then what is the motor neuron doing? Carrying information away from the CNS, away from the spinal cord towards the effector. Clear? And of course, in between the sensory and the motor, now that I talk inside the spinal cord, in between the sensory and neuron, between the sensory and the motor, there are small neurons acting as bridges. Acting as bridges, carrying the messages from here to the next neuron. So this neuron is just acting as a bridging gap. And these are very small, short neurons placed between the sensory and the motor. Now, when I talk about the components again, receptor, sensory neuron, spinal cord, motor neuron, the target gland or the effector. Now, you are asked generally difference between the sensory and the motor neuron and based on the function. So this is what we have to write. So this is the entire pathway for nerve impulse transmission. I'm saying from a sensory neuron, the message would go this way and then enter the spinal cord and then come out and then come and reach the effector. So this entire pathway, what is it known as? This entire pathway is known as the reflex arc. The entire pathway that we understand, whenever there is a reflex, you step on something pricky, you immediately withdraw your feet. At the time, which part of the nervous system is not involved in this entire action is the brain. The thinking process of the brain is not involved because the spinal cord took the decision on its own. Because the decision has to be prompt. The action has to be very rapid. But now that I ask you, take out your book and start writing, the action need not be that rapid. You may take 2 minutes to pick the book, open up and start writing. Now that you are walking on the road, the action need not be that rapid. So that's the reason the spinal cord with the brain together does the job, helps in doing the job. But involuntary, let me again talk about involuntary. If I talk about involuntary functions also, the movement of the food in the food pipe, should it be very rapid? Not necessary, because no way we are coming across any danger or any type of an accident. But you are walking on the road, the moment you see the flash and you are not taking the right of the road, maybe you come across an accident. You are touching something very hard, and in that particular situation, if the spinal cord immediately does not give the commands to your hand muscles, you remain there or touch that hot pot for another 5-6 seconds or a couple of minutes. In that process, the fingertips, the skin may burn. So the moment we touch, we immediately withdraw. So what's happening? Why that rapid thing? Why that rapid process? Why the process so very instant? Because the spinal cord does not allow the messages to go to the brain. Straight away it sends it to the motor neuron. Then otherwise what happens? Otherwise, from here it will first go to the brain and then come back. And then the motor neuron. So in any type of a reflex, the function of which sensory organ, which organ of the nervous system is absolutely does not take place. The function of the brain does not take place always. So remember, I am talking about the reflex arc right now. Reflex action is a response. What is reflex arc? It's a pathway. Pathway for what? Pathway for nerve impulse transmission, which is very rapid. Then how do we define what is this reflex arc? It is the shortest pathway of nerve impulse transmission. What is reflex arc? It is the shortest pathway of nerve impulse transmission. It is the shortest pathway of nerve impulse transmission. Why do we say it is the shortest pathway? Now can you tell me? Why do we say it is the shortest pathway? Because the entire process of sending the message to the brain and waiting for the commands of the brain is absolutely cut down. So definitely the time taken is much lesser. It's very prompt, that's why. So whenever we are talking about the reflex arc, what is the definition? Is the definition of the reflex action and the reflex arc the same? No, these are two different things. Reflex action is one, reflex arc is another. Tell me one or two more examples of reflex action if you have understood. Give me one or two more examples of reflex action apart from what I told you just now. Reflex action, what did you understand? Can you relate to some examples? If also, now that there's a strong breeze, there's a strong gush of air, what happens? You happen to move your face. Immediately there's a response you show. What else? That I told you. Say something different. If you have understood, you know so many examples in our day-to-day life. Reflex. What have you understood?
Someone tries to read immediately.
Somebody is
Trying to read, then we can immediately.
somebody trying to hit you, you try to defend yourself. Somebody throwing the ball at you, you make an action to catch the ball. So all these things are also reflex action. All these things are also reflex action. But in all the examples, whichever example you pick up, something that is common is reflex actions are always protective in nature. Reflex action is always protective in nature. Somebody is throwing the ball at you and you are trying to pick up, they're also actually just protective in nature. You are touching something hot or very cold and you try to withdraw your hand or your feet, of course it is protective in nature. So likewise, why the action so prompt? Whenever you are asked questions, reflex action is rapid, justified. Reflex action is spontaneous. Explain, what will you write? Because most of these actions are not involving the thinking process of the brain, so that's why the actions are so rapid. And on top of that, most of them are protective in nature. So the body cannot wait to show the response for a long time. In that case, the body would go through certain damages, some accidents. The body would definitely go through certain damages or accidents. Is this clear? So about the spinal cord, some few concepts and the names and the components of the reflex action. Reflex are collateral. We will write down the difference between sensory and motor. Anyone in the table, notebook, make a table. Yes.
How would you define a receptor?
Receptor, specialized group of cells which can receive stimulus. What is a receptor? Always. What are the 5 different types of receptor? No, terms. What are the 5 different types of receptors? The 5 different types of receptors are, when we are talking about the receptors, what is the definition of receptors? Receptor, the definition is specialized group of cells. Specialized group of cells that can receive, specialized group of cells that can receive stimulus. Any specialized group of cell that can receive stimulus is a receptor. Types क्या है? कौन-कौन से types? Which are the types of receptor? Number 1, I talk about the mechanoreceptor. Now that I talk about the mechanoreceptor, that is the skin. I talk about the photoreceptor. Which is a photoreceptor? Photoreceptor would be the eyes. Third is I talk about the ears, the photoreceptor. So the photoreceptor would be the ears. Next, olfactory receptors. Now that I talk about the olfactory receptor, that is the nose. And then fifth is the gustatory receptor, and that is the tongue. And we also have got the thigmoreceptor is another one. Thigmoreceptor is also known as the skin, and it's also the skin there. So at least these 5 definitely we should know the different types of receptors. What are receptors? Receptors are specialized group of cells receiving stimulus. Is that clear? Any doubt here? Types of receptors. What are the different types, and what is common in all these receptors?
Yeah.
I talk about the photoreceptor. They are receiving light. Photoreceptor receiving sound.
They receive stimulus.
All of them are receiving some of the other type of stimulus. That may be in the corner. What are the different forms of stimulus then? If you're asked that. What are the different forms of stimulus?
Light, sound, taste.
Touch है, chemicals है.
Taste.
Okay, chemicals. That will come in the form of chemicals. So now that we are talking about olfactory and gustatory, that is basically chemical, and then touch, and then light, and then sound. All these are different types. Clear? Types of receptors and their names and what type of stimulus they respond to. Of
Sensories and motor.
sensory and motor you will write in the notebook. Definition only you need for the receptor. effector definition, if you have to write, group of cells or muscles, group of cells, muscles or gland that show a response. Group of cells for the effector I'm talking about. How would you define an effector? What is the effector doing? Always showing response, right? So how do you define a group of cell, muscle, group of cell, comma, muscle or a gland? Group of cell, muscle or a gland that shows a response. That shows a response on receiving the stimulus. Shows a response on receiving the stimulus. Now, one question we will write difference between sensory and motor. Write it down. Mechanoreceptor, M-E-C-H-A-N-O. Mechanoreceptor, that is the skin. Thermoreceptor, when we are talking about the thermoreceptor, that will again be the skin. Shows a response after receiving the stimulus. Shows a response after receiving stimulus. What are you saying?
Ma'am, is there a
Thigmoreceptor also, but that is majorly for the plants. Thigmoreceptor also for human also, that is there, but we will generally use a word like mechanoreceptor more frequently. Ultimately, that's why I said thigmoreceptor and mechanoreceptor is almost the same thing. Thermoreceptor also, when I talk about thermoreceptor, it is the skin only which can respond to heat or cold. Difference between sensory and motor. Write down sensory neurons. Sensory neurons carry impulses from sensory neurons would carry impulses from way to way. See the diagram from way to way. Receptor to the spinal cord. Carry impulses from the receptor to spinal cord. Carry impulses from receptor to spinal cord. What next? Motor neuron. Motor neuron carry impulses from spinal cord to the effector. From spinal cord to effector. From spinal cord to effector. Got that? Carry impulses from spinal cord to effector. So we are talking about the basic differences between the spinal cord and, the sensory and motor. Now you get one more question. If there is an injury in the spinal cord, if somebody is due to an accident, the spinal cord has suffered from certain change, some damage, the person immediately collapses. Can you tell me why? Why should that happen? I've already given you the functions of the spinal cord.
It's a backbone of
Because connected to brain, not that much.
the backbone of the body.
It is linked to all the neurons in the body, so the neurons is
Partially. What else? What are the functions of the spinal cord? Just now we had studied. Controls all the voluntary and involuntary functions, controls the reflexes. Now let us try understanding. An injury to the spinal cord leads to the death of an individual. Why? Majorly because when the spinal cord is injured, remember what's happening? The entire process of controlling the involuntary functions gradually slows down and comes to a stop. So the person's lungs not moving, blood vessels not moving, heart not moving, nothing, slowly all slows down and shuts down. So this person, in a period of few minutes to half an hour, definitely will start collapsing. Because the major vital functions in our body are all involuntary in nature. You talk about the function of the heart, you talk about the function of the lungs, you talk about the blood flow, you talk about the process of digestion, everything is involuntary and everything is controlled by the spinal cord. So a damage happening in the spinal cord would lead to collapsing of an individual. Give reason. Will you remember that? You write down that question. Remember what I told you. Now next is, after the spinal cord, we'll talk about the next part of the central nervous system, that is the brain. The diagram of the brain, we will not take it now at the end of the session because this diagram of the brain hardly comes, but it comes. But it comes in the exam. We will practice drawing this diagram later. As of now, you will just note down in the next page, go to a fresh page and write down, draw a neat diagram of the brain. Now that in 1-2 week time you try to finish that. Keep one page for that. So by the time I move on with other topics, once we are almost done, I'm going to check, and then again we will, at least in one more revision class, we will take these diagrams all together. That time again I will ask you to revise this diagram. Now, write down the question in one page there, take a fresh page, preferably draw the section of human brain. Now, you will try drawing it from the diagram in the volume. It's very clear there, the same diagram as there in the textbook. All of you refer to the diagram there. Today I am not able to show you any images, so refer to the diagram. All have that book. All of you take out your volume. Where's your volume? Not this. Take out. Which page? Volume page 186. All of you turn to that page, that textbook or the volume. The same diagram. We are talking about the parts and functions of the brain now. What are the different parts of the brain? The functions of the brain. Now, the major parts of the brain. We talk about the human brain. What are the major parts to understand and the function? Now, this human brain that we are talking about, it is completely made up of neurons. It is completely made up of neurons. It is an extensive network of neurons. What is this human brain made up of? Extensive network of neurons. And what would be the bony cover? Now let us talk about the protective structures of the brain. So I would talk about the bony cover of the brain. What is the bony cover of the brain? The bony cover of the brain would be known as the skull, also known as the cranium. The bony cover of the brain would be known as the skull, also known as the cranium. Next is, we talk about the membranous cover. Just next to the skull, the membranous cover of the brain, that is known as the meninges. Now I say this is membranous, meaning it is not made up of bones, but it is made up of certain connective tissues, epithelial tissues. And this is what we are talking about, the meninges. Right after the meninges or in between the meninges. Now I would say that these particular meninges, there are 3 layers, one after the other. This entire meninges that we understand, there are 3 specific layers, one after the other. So now looking into the meninges, there are 3 specific layers as I mentioned. And between these layers, what is there? There is a characteristic fluid. And what is the name of this fluid? The name of this fluid is cerebrospinal fluid. The name of this fluid is cerebrospinal fluid. Now, this cerebrospinal fluid, what would be its function? Where is it present, first of all? What is cerebrospinal fluid? It is a transparent watery liquid fluid present where? Present between the first and the second and the third membranous cover of the brain. Then when we are talking about the first and the second and the third layer, so this fluid is almost filling up, giving a puffy structure to the entire membrane, almost like a cushion of the pillows. So that the internal nervous structures, which is extremely delicate and regulating all the functions of our body, immediately does not get affected by any type of a mechanical injury. That's the major advantage that we get, that we enjoy. So what is this cerebrospinal fluid helping in? Number 1, providing nourishment, definitely. Providing nourishment to the neurons. Providing nourishment to the neurons of the brain. What is protection from mechanical injury? We talk about protection from mechanical injury. Now, what does that mean? Mechanical injury, now that we are talking about protection from mechanical injury, that I say, What does that mean? Now, quite a number of times, we always get hurt here, there, we hit. And if not now, if I talk back there, if I go back, especially the childhood days, you don't even remember how many number of times you fell down, hit your head here, there. But then all of you seem to be quite normal, yes or no? So now, why how is it possible? How is it we are still normal? So now how is it possible? So many times a child must have fallen down, any single child you talk about, 20, 25 times minimum the child all throughout the period of 5, 6 years must have fallen down, must have with the head here there. This particular resistant cushion, the structure generally protects from any type of shocks, injury, mechanical injuries, jerks, and at the same time balances the entire pressure in the brain. So these are some specific functions that you have to remember. There are many, at least 2 or 3 you should understand. What are the 2 major functions of the cerebrospinal fluid that I am mentioning? Number 1, provides nourishment to the neurons, because the fluid is made up of a full concentration of extremely rich concentration of ions and minerals. And next is protection from mechanical injury and shocks and jerks. So that's a major concept too, right? From mechanical injury and then shocks and jerks. So this is what you majorly write as a function. Now, what are the parts and their function? What are the parts of the brain? What are the parts of the brain? Did you ever study about the brain earlier? What are the parts? What are the major parts of the brain? Can anybody tell me? What are the major parts of the brain? Forebrain. Forebrain has which part? Major part of the brain is the cerebrum. So now, if you look into the diagram, let us study this way. What are the parts of the brain? The parts of the brain. I would start with this. The first is the forebrain. I start with the forebrain. The forebrain is the major part of the brain. And on top of the forebrain, the first part to talk about is the cerebrum. So I start with the cerebrum. Look into the diagram. Maybe the diagram is not there. I'm constantly telling you. Keep the volume here. As I speak, you refer to the diagram. Cerebrum from where to where? Which part of the brain are we talking about? Cerebrum starts from the mid of the forehead till the back of the head, just above. You can feel the skull here, the hard bony cover. So almost at the level of the ear, that is the cerebrum. Right, start from the mid part of the forehead and the entire, and that is a major part of the brain that we are talking about. The entire region from here to here, from here to here, that is all the cerebrum. So what are some of the features of the cerebrum to remember? The largest part of the brain. Cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. Now this cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain that we understand, what is it made up of? Arrangement of neurons, packed arrangement of neurons. So features of the cerebrum to understand, this is the largest part of the brain. It is the largest part of the brain. What else? This cerebrum has got halves. And what are these halves of the cerebrum known as? These are known as the cerebral hemispheres. The entire brain that we understand has got halves. Now, first of all, we are only talking about the cerebrum. When I say that the entire region from back to front to back and from right to left, this entire region is a cerebrum. But the question is it only one mass of neurons? No, it is not. It is two masses put together very close. So what are these two masses known as? Two groups known as? This is one particular group and this is one particular group. So what are these two groups known as? Cerebral hemispheres. What is the meaning? The two halves of the cerebrum. The two halves of the cerebrum, what are they known as? The cerebral hemispheres, and these cerebral hemispheres constantly keep regulating functions. And something to always remember, that these group of neurons that we understand will always regulate the functions on the left side. These group of neurons that you talk about always regulate functions on the right side. How is it understood? whenever a person suffers from paralysis. Whenever a person suffers from paralysis, it is always understood that if the person goes or if the person has suffered paralysis on the right side of the body, the neurons damaged are this side. And a person who has gone through paralysis on the left side of the body, the neurons which are responsible or damaged are on the right side. So it is always this concept, the right side regulates the left and the left side regulates the right. And in between the two halves, there is as if a crisscross arrangement of neurons. So that also has a specific name. So as of now, understand what is the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. It is a packed arrangement of neurons and it has got halves. What are the halves of the cerebrum known as? Cerebral hemispheres, and this particular region is extremely folded. It has got folds and grooves. Check the diagram. The cerebrum has folds and grooves. So when I talk about the arrangement of the neurons, how are the arrangement of the neurons there? The arrangement of the neurons are all like this. The arrangement of the neurons are all like this. Yes or no? So when we are talking about the arrangement of the neurons, there are folds. There are folds. Now if I draw these folds little bit very clear, then I should be actually drawing them something like this. I should be drawing them actually something like this. So between any two folds, there is always a depression. So it is something like the bundles of the neurons are all folded and folded and folded. Can you tell me why so much compactness? Why so much compactness? So that more and more number of neurons, millions of neurons here, so that the processes can be so efficiently controlled, because this part of the body is controlling the rest of all the functions. And the packing unit of the neuron here, how many neurons we must be having all throughout the body? Millions and millions of neurons. So now that we are talking about the millions of neurons in this particular region, if I say we humans should be having a number of neurons in a range, is not so. Now I would say, for an example, I'm saying in human, the number of neurons in the brain should be something around 400 to 500. A person who has number of neurons on the higher side, 480 and 490, the packing is extremely compact. So that person is always having a higher retention, higher IQ, higher reasoning, higher willpower. And the person who is having little bit on the lower side will always have little bit will be on the weaker side. So what is the concept of packaging here? Packaging more surface area so that nerve impulse transmission is very efficient here. So here we try understanding what is the necessity of the folds and the grooves. What are folds and grooves? Folds and grooves here mean the constant folding pattern of the neurons. What are the functions of the cerebrum? Functions are what? What are the functions of the cerebrum? Number one, functions of the cerebrum would be, what are the functions of the cerebrum you feel? Number one, controlling all the voluntary activities. Number one, that's the major function. Function of cerebrum controls the voluntary activities, controls all the voluntary actions. Can you tell me two voluntary actions that our body shows? Writing and
speaking,
moving, walking, running, writing. Any type of a muscular activity that we are talking about, that is what is known as voluntary activity. Which part of the brain controls? Remember, voluntary activity is always controlled by the cerebrum. Apart from that, what? Apart from that, the other function of the cerebrum is the different type of sensory perception. Sensory perception, that is the second function. So when we are talking about the sensory perception, variety of different type of sensory perceptions, like, what are the different types of sensory perception? Like vision, sensation of vision, and then hearing, and then smell, and then taste. All would be functions of cerebrum. Remember, functions of cerebrum. The cerebrum has got another group of functions. Number one, it is the seat of memory. It is the seat of memory, and then intelligence, and then willpower, and then reasoning. Whenever we are talking about individuals, behavioral aspects, each one of us will differ in this behavioral aspects. Now, why are we different when we are talking about why individual to individual? This aspect is different because whenever we are talking about individual, the packing unit, just now I explained you this, the packing unit of the neurons in the cerebrum, they are different. Though we are of the same species, we don't possess the same number of neurons. The packing, the arrangement of the neurons in some individual bit more compact, in some individual bit more less compact, and that is what decides the behavioral aspect. This is a very important point you are always asked questions on. So what is the major function of the cerebrum? Number one, definitely the voluntary functions we are talking about. Number two, behavioral functions like memory, willpower, reasoning, analysis. It's all because of the packing unit of the cerebrum. Till this much clear? Anything to clarify? We have been talking about the reflex action, the reflex arm, the components, and just now I discussed about the parts of the brain, talking about the functions of the first part, that is the cerebrum. What is the cerebral hemisphere? It is the half of the cerebrum. Three functions of the cerebrum, are they clear? What are the three functions of the cerebrum? The sensory functions, voluntary functions, and the third is memory, responsible for the memory and the intelligence and this type of behavioral function. Next is, we are talking about the forebrain. Since we are talking about the forebrain, we also have to talk about the second part of the forebrain. Look for the hypothalamus in the diagram. Can you see the hypothalamus in the diagram? Hypothalamus is also another part of the forebrain. It comes under another major head, but we are not mentioning this. So here we talk about the hypothalamus, which is also a part of the forebrain. Which is a part of the forebrain. Is this chapter done in school? Done in school? So did they teach you hypothalamus?
Yes.
Thalamus also?
No.
Thalamus no, only hypothalamus. Hypothalamus you mark. What is the function of hypothalamus? We'll complete with this. This hypothalamus, which is also a part of the forebrain, remember, its job is to regulate the body temperature. Regulate the body temperature. That is one of the most important function of the hypothalamus. Regulates the body temperature. And this hypothalamus, that's why it is also known as a, what is it also? Nay? Hypothalamus is known as the master of master gland, but that has no reference here. That is pituitary you are talking about. Pituitary.
Releasing hormones. It releases hormones which activates the functioning of other.
But that function you will not write here. This is not, that is the endocrine function. Here you will have to write down only the nervous function. What is the job of hypothalamus? What is the function hypothalamus is doing? Hypothalamus regulates the body temperature. How? That is what you are asked in the paper. How does hypothalamus regulate the body temperature? By two different ways. Now that in the summertime we sweat a lot because the blood supply to the skin increases. And winter time our skin becomes dry. Why? Because during the winter or now that you sit in the AC room, why are we not sweating? Because the blood supply, the blood vessels shrinks, blood supply decreases. So this concept you will have to write here. So you are asked to write down the function of hypothalamus. Which particular region regulates body temperature? Hypothalamus regulates the body temperature. How? You just write down these 2 points here very fast. Hypothalamus regulates, this is the function you should know. How also you should know. Hypothalamus regulates body temperature by two pathways. Number one, Number one, when the outside temperature is very high, that is in summer or when you are exercising, etc. When outside temperature is very high, it increases the blood supply to the skin. And results in profuse sweating. So now when there is sweating, remember the body is not able to increase the temperature. Yes or no? Are you understanding what I'm speaking? The outside temperature, think of a situation, now it is summertime. The outside temperature is 42. Will our body temperature become 42? No. Why? Because hypothalamus increases blood supply to the skin. We start sweating. So since we are sweating, the body is already doing work and releasing heat. In that process, the body cannot develop a temperature 40 degree. वो 37.5 पे ही अटक के रह जाता है. It cannot raise up the temperature क्योंकि already वो काम कर रहा है in making the sweat from the blood. Blood को filter करके sweat बनाने में उसको energy release करना पड़ा. So that is the first point that I am talking about. Number two, when the surrounding temperature is very low, the blood supply to the skin is decreased. Making the skin dry. Full stop. And also leading to shivering. So, how our body temperature never increases to 42 when it is so hot, and why our body temperature does not rise or fall down to 18 also when it is cold, or 6 degrees when it is cold, because the hypothalamus is constantly leading to shivering. So constantly जब जरूरत है perspiration बढ़ा देता है, जब जरूरत नहीं है blood supply कम कर देता है. So that's the reason we are able to maintain a stable temperature, regulates body temperature. We'll continue with the hindbrain. Midbrain you don't have to study. Midbrain school में पढ़ाया है. Midbrain is not there. Only the hindbrain, 3 parts of the hindbrain you will have to study. We'll continue the next one.